that the authors not actually have to take notes about their commentaries. Nancy Kenny, who's a pro, who's actually been, here's Nancy, she's been filming the New Urbanism literally from the time some of us were 35 years old. And she has a huge amount of archival film, and I mean film, about all sorts of young Peter Calthorpe spouting off, you know, in the early days. It's a treasure trove. There's another Nancy called Nancy Bruning, who's back there. And Nancy is writing a book on lean urbanism with the explicit purpose, and by the way, it is taking the discussion of the swarm, listening in, and Nancy is an author of many books on many subjects, including co-author, actually, the ghost behind the original New Urbanism book, the blue one by Peter Katz. So she was there from the absolute 1998 beginning. 98? Yeah. 1898. The 1898 beginning. And among the things she has done is one of the reasons that she is actually so quickly able to write a book on this subject is not only is she steeped in the beginning of the New Urbanism, the way we operate, but she also has a very lean ethos. And so the lean ethos is one of the hardest things to get across because it is definitely not New Urbanism. New Urbanism is the platform that basically, the charter of the New Urbanism is what we're after, but the way of thinking is different. And much of the early discussion that took place in the internet and a lot of disciplining that had to take place was in order to stay within what we call the lean seam. There is a constant tendency to heal the world entirely, you know, all the way from climate change to the poor bees, you know, all sorts of stuff. And there are two things that concern us about this. One is that whatever we do, we want to do very, very quickly. Okay, and this does not involve fundamental reform, which is kind of shocking. Yes, we know that there's a great need for affordable housing. Yes, we know that the IT has to be reformed. Yes, we know about climate change. And there are two things that I think Lean has to discipline, which is, first of all, it's not our job. Our job is to do whatever can be done as quickly as possible through patches, workarounds, you know, clever stuff. The clever stuff that many of us know how to do, and what we want to do is actually make it public. How is it that we get anything done in this difficult world of impediments and regulators and, you know, difficulties everywhere, and yet some of us get things done? And instead of it becoming local professional secrets, what we'd like to do is understand the philosophy behind it, systematize it, and make it available as soon as possible to the younger generation so that they don't have to wait 25 years to discover how it's done. And so in some ways, it's about the older, experienced generation actually, in some ways, teaching the tricks of the trade to the younger generation, something that you're going to have to learn anyway, because it's the air we breathe, and yet why not transfer it as young as possible, as early as possible, so that people, while they're still young, can get major things done. I do realize, we all realize that the young are getting a lot of things done, but they're rather small things, you know, and it's magnificent. It's an incredibly creative initiative. It is coming more and more to be defined as tactical urbanism. You know, the demonstration projects, the pilot projects, all these things that are getting things going. But ultimately, you actually might want to actually develop real buildings and become real developers and start businesses that really grow. So this is the next stage, and I'm going to be very careful to define this. How do you actually move on to the next stage so that you can do bigger things while still young? Literally, I hate to be so crude, but we don't like to see the millennials waiting till they're 45 and 50 years old before they become real developers. And we've identified all over America and England actually initiatives at every level that actually should be better known. So that's the thesis of lean urbanism. The second thesis So it's one of transference, et cetera. But the second thesis is very important. If somebody else is already on the case, we don't need to pile on. As soon as we identify, oh, they're already doing that, and in fact, there are layers of organizations dealing with climate change, layers of organizations dealing with HUD reform, layers of organizations dealing with the banking system. That's what the CNU does. The CNU has grown up, and people who were among us very early on are now in Washington. It's amazing. There are CNU members that are, that are very close to the secretaries in Washington. There's CNU members that are now the mayors. I mean, I remember kids who were mayors now. When we would do a charrette in a place, and not only has the kid become a mayor, but the kid has become an ex-mayor. He's already the old man in the city. And so the CNU has matured and grown, and one of the ways I like to think about it is that when one of us, and I mean there are dozens of people in the CNU, that when we phone somebody at the very top level, they actually pick up the phone, which is, we're still not used to that. It's kind of amazing. But oh yes, they take our advice. It generally comes with white hair, But there's nevertheless, or because of that, that is very much in control, that level. I repeat, there's an energy which is terrific, which is now being formalized largely within the CNU, and that's a kind of a miracle called tactical urbanism. Mike Lydon and his buddies, it's just been pulled in, and it's becoming very powerful. It's very romantic. It's exactly what the very young should be doing. And then there's something in between that we call the lean seam. Okay, which is in between what tactical urbanism is doing and what the new urbanism is doing, that somehow nobody is taking care of. And it's full of possibilities. Now, one of the criteria of lean urbanism is that if we encounter resistance, if there's going to see, well, we bypass it. Okay, as soon as there's resistance, as soon as you have to get, super organized and super funded and get, and sort of allocate years of your life to get anything done, we say, not for us. The CNU does that, right? And we just bypass it and see. It's always about the seam. So I'm going to speak a little bit about what that seam is like, just to get everybody, because so many people came in that in fact may not have that, and the discussion may go off the, even more off the rails by actually saying, well, what about this, what about that? And you'll see me always saying, no, that's not in the lean seam, somebody else taking care of it. So that's the idea. So I'm going to bust up the schedule a little bit, but before I do that, I would like Brian Falk, who is managing this. We received it's very typical of this initiative. It is so timely that very, very quickly, hardly asking for it, it was recognized as important, and we received a grant from the Knight Foundation in Miami. It's a 3-year grant. And this is the first year of the grant. And the first year, we were asked by the Knight Foundation to have a series of conferences to actually learn where the talent is, to learn who has the solutions. And we've been having conferences in Detroit, and we've been having we had one in San Diego, where California is absolutely choked on bureaucratic impediments. So we thought, let's see what that's like. One of the things we found is that at the same time that you choke on impediments, you actually develop bypasses that are very sophisticated. It's very cool the way that a democratic society responds to problems. It's almost immediately on the case. And some of the most sophisticated bypasses are being developed in California. And then we had one where we're going to a place that has fewer impediments. Like, for example, we've all been very intrigued by the ability to get things done in the Sun Belt. The Texas, Alabama, Mississippi, places where you can get things done. I mean, Airbus just opened its American factory in Mobile, Alabama, which is astounding. You say, well, why aren't they at Caltech? Why aren't they close to MIT? And part of the reason is they couldn't get a permit in time. It couldn't happen in a timely way. So here we have one of the largest aircraft factories in the world being built in Mobile, Alabama, 2 miles from downtown. And that's the kind of thing that you say, whoa, this is what happens when you have a light regulatory environment. Like, good things happen quickly. The second year, we will formulate The tools. The tools, once we know what people know, what each of us knows, we'll formulate literally the tools. We'll mint, what Steve Mouzon calls the forge. We're going to be a tool forge. We're not quite waiting for that second year. And Hank Dittmar, who was the head of the Prince's Foundation, has been for many, many years, is tracking this. And apart from being our transit guy from the very old days and being the head of the board from some very important years and the author of several books, Hank had this idea called the Lean Scan, in which it's a protocol that you show up in a city and very, very quickly identify the possibilities, what can be done, where the talent is. So it's the first of our tools. And we're going to give Hank a real presentation, today with his team. He's assembled a team, David Brain, Scott Bernstein. He's assembled a team, and he will be formulating the first and possibly the most important of the tools. You show up, figure it out, scan it, and say what are the possibilities. So he has a bigger presentation. Okay. Nancy, who has to put out, this topic is so hot that if we don't stake a position as early adopters, we're going to be seen as followers. I'm not kidding. It's literally multiplying. If you track this ethos of people saying we can't wait to get things done, things are too urgent, we don't have enough money. If you track that, you'll realize that we can't spend 3 years before we make our great proposal to the world, because we're going to be very much Johnny-come-latelys. So Nancy is doing the difficult task of writing a book very, very quickly with what there is. I frankly think there's a huge amount of material. In fact, the problem is there's too much material already because of the internet discussion and the general sort of creativity that's emerging everywhere. So we're going to help Nancy. We're going to help Nancy actually discuss her book. And I at least have 4 chapters of it. I don't know how many exist. I've read 4 chapters. Yeah. So Nancy will have a discussion, we'll talk, and we will see her attitude. And it was very interesting. Nancy came late to the group, and it was interesting to see her catch up in the internet and ask questions, which of course was very useful. Like, what do you mean by this? What do you mean by that? The kind of saying, well, isn't that a dopey question? But actually, that dopey question is exactly what everybody's going to ask. So by Nancy coming in a bit late as an outsider, she asked all the questions. Okay, so that's happening. And then there's J.P. Faber over there, who hardly anyone knows, except he was Douglas's roommate in high school, in boarding school. And I've literally known him since something like 1965. And J.P. has actually started quite a few, quite sort of edgy magazines. And he has a certain style of writing that everybody wants to read. It's irreverent. His latest magazine was on plastic surgery. It's called New You. And you can imagine how, edgy that can be. And so one of the things I thought is, could JP actually write up the pilot projects? Not the pilot project, I'm sorry, the case studies. The case studies. And we've identified 8 or 10 in 5 pairs. Really cool stuff. Stuff that is happening under the big things that are nevertheless happening. The regulators don't even know how to deal with it. And you'll see places like the Neshoba County Fair, which Sarah Hines has been studying for many, many years, these southern camps and so forth where people build, essentially quasi-permanent structures that have lasted 100 years without permits. But also, what about Burning Man? Where they set up a city of 10,000 people with 10 rules. 60,000 people with 10 rules. And spectacularly what's happening in Detroit and so forth. So JP has, we've identified, I think 10, right? Or it's 10. 10 places, and we pair them up. Some of them are large, some of them are small, some of them are old, some of them are new. And there's a certain tension. For example, there's Detroit and what's happening there, and Dan Camp and what he's been doing for 30 years in Starkville, Mississippi. And what can one learn from the other? For example, can Dan Camp actually go basically multiply himself? You know, what's the scene with this guy? And because he's worked it out. So because this is very, very new, we're going to put JP up here and there'll be a discussion. I mean, at any level, like this is what you know about it, this is the angle, is there something else that's cool that we can come up? Okay, so that's going to be, and JP's writing will be actually picked up by magazines. By the way, here's Douglas, who hasn't seen JP for a long time. Watch this. You asshole. So anyway, there's a nice. Where was I? You asshole. It's very, very open. That part is very open. And the way to imagine it is not so much a book, but maybe as a video. If this works out, we'll follow him interviewing unsuspecting people, you know, about what it is that they're doing. People who don't even know what they're doing is cool. Okay, so we'll see how that works out. That's very early. By the way, the grant was granted to the Center for Applied Transect Studies, which is the think tank that, for example, was responsible for, it's a not-for-profit that was responsible for the smart code and the transect and so forth, and actually subsidizing and creating quite a few books that you will see. You'll see CATS appearing. It's a way to help books to happen and authors and so forth. But CATS has been, I mean, it hasn't been a small operation, but now it has to be a very disciplined operation for the first time because we're responsible tonight. And one of the things that we'd like you all to understand is just a little bit of how that works. And so Brian's going to come up here and speak for a little while about the financing and what we're meant to do, just so that everybody's on the same page about, because at some point, you know, the interface is very professional. We do what we do, and we run around, and we say what we want, but ultimately, we have to deliver to the Knight Foundation. CATS has for years been seeking donations. Now, I don't know whether you remember, but when we received the Driehaus Prize from the Driehaus Foundation Notre Dame, that was $200,000, and that was put into CATS. That's how CATS began. Before that time, the work on the transect was volunteering off DPZ's back. Okay, DPZ paid for the transect development and the smart code, and at some point when the recession hit, we couldn't do that anymore. There was just no fat left. And so it began with the Driehaus Award. And the feeling Liz and I have is that it's whatever we get is collective. You know, we're personally rewarded for what is really a collective endeavor. So we put that prize into it, and we've received other, an Orem Foundation donation. We have received one from there have been others periodically, but generally much smaller than the Knight Foundation grant. So yes, we're in the business, for example, and one of the problems that we're having is that the Grant Foundation is that the Knight Foundation is actually a large enough grant to do research, but it's not really a large enough grant to do the work. If we're going to take a city and make an example out of it, you know, for example, you'll hear about what a pink zone is, which is basically a major charrette with follow-up. While the grant seems large, it's not large enough for professional work. And so we need to, as soon as we start working in real cities and applying, we're going to need additional grants. And Hank, of course, is an old hand at grants because of the Princess Foundation, which has been a very big operation. But anybody else that can help, by the way, and like everything else, at a certain point, this becomes decentralized. You know, so what we imagine is a year and a half of disciplined endeavor, and then everything is freeware. And you can just take the initiative and go with it. But right now we're in the discipline mode. The point person is Brian Falk of CATS for receiving contributions. And it's a not-for-profit. You can filter it. Most of it is flow-through. Like if you yourself are not a not-for-profit, but you want to do let's say create a pink zone. By the way, the pink zone is like a planned unit development in which the level of red tape has been reduced. Okay, by professionals. You reduce, you pre-negotiate the level of red tape so that people who actually have less experience or smaller budgets can actually act within the city. It's an overlay zone. It's like an enterprise zone, but specifically created so that people who don't want to read the fat old regulations, people who don't want to renovate to the highest level, all this stuff has been pre-negotiated by people who basically have experience in doing that, but downloaded to the smaller people who don't have the wherewithal to do it. If you want to do that and you can get a grant, you can flow it through CATS. We basically, there's a kind of small tolling charge for managing it and for making sure you don't disgrace the, CATS with third-rate work. Second-rate's all right, but third-rate work, we aspire to second-rate. But it takes some effort to do this. So I think it's important that Buff, you sort of bring up the reality that we do need funding to get things done. So Brian's going to take you through the discipline that we're working under. And actually what Brian does is he provides that interface, that difficult interface between creative people, energetic people, confused people, and a group that actually wants to hear it straight. And so this is if you would.
Good morning. I'm the difficult interface that Andrés just referred to, Brian Falk. I manage the Center for Applied Transect Studies, and that is the nonprofit that is administering the project for Lean Urbanism. What Andrés is going to talk about and what the presenters throughout the week are going to talk about is the concept and the movement of Lean Urbanism. But before we get to that, I wanted to give you some information about the project for Lean Urbanism, which is an important distinction. We received the Knight Foundation grant that Andrés referred to. It's a $600,000 grant for 3 years. In order to get it activated early and get the jump on it that Andrés was referring to, we requested that it be front-loaded. And so we're getting half of the grant amount in the first year. And then you see year 2 and 3. Here it's reduced. So our, excuse me, our activities will be on the grant this year, and then we're going to be looking for additional funding for those pilot projects, for example, that Andrés mentioned. The schedule, in simple terms, year 1 is dedicated to research. Year 2 is dedicated to the pilot projects, and year 3, I'm calling it a rollout, and I'll explain what that means in just a moment. For research, we have a few key components, a few major activities. We've had councils already, and we'll continue to have a few more. Andrés described those a little while ago. The first one was in Detroit. The purpose was to gather all the people that had been a part of that listserv conversation that he described and talk to each other, learn from each other, as well as learn from the great example of Detroit. We've subsequently had one in San Diego where the primary focus quickly became the Woodbury University Masters of Real Estate Development at their School of Architecture. A great example of lean education, which, as you'll see on the other slide, is one of the platforms of our project. What we've been doing, dedicating most of our time to the first 6 months, is research through studies, through papers and through books. We have commissioned 3 books. I think Andrés described only 2. Another is by Sarah Hines, which is profiling the camp meeting movement as a case study, an archetype for lean urbanism, and she's written a paper about it, and she will be presenting about it this week. In addition, the papers, we've commissioned roughly 40 of them. Approximately 20 are at a sufficient stage to present here this week, and you can find those, by the way, on leanurbanism.org on the publications page. You can read those that are complete, and you can download PDFs of all of them, even the drafts. The third thing will be the tools. What we're planning to do is develop some prototype tools that we can implement in the pilot projects the second year, which leads to identifying the pilot projects. We have to figure out, of course, where we're going to do them. And projection is something that will take place in all 3 years. The simple idea is to spread the word, to raise awareness of the problems and our proposed solutions. I described the council, the 2 of the councils. The most recent we had was at Seaside. It was dedicated exclusively to small-scale development. And we brought in developers to teach us everything they could. And one of the things that emerged from there that was perhaps the most interesting was Bill Giedema's idea for what he calls a developer in a box. It's going to be a tool that he proposes to teach people basically everything they need to know, from techniques to financing, to roles, to talent, and so forth, to get started in small-scale development. This one, of course, is Buffalo. Our purpose here is to let you see what we've been doing, what we've been researching over the last few months, and to get feedback and refine them. These papers, as I said, we have roughly 40. They break down into position papers and case studies. The 3 books that have already been described, and I think Andrés mentioned the video documentary that we have that we have planned also, and that is going to focus on the case studies. The tools that we're going to create will largely be inspired by the position papers. So we have people who are telling us what we need to do and proposing solutions, and we're going to develop the tools from that. We're creating prototypes, as I said, and they'll be tested and evaluated in the pilot projects in the second year. They're going to focus, the form they will take will primarily be information, explaining processes, what we are tentatively calling workarounds, thresholds. A workaround, if there's an obstacle, we figure out, we help you find a way to get around it. A threshold, an example of one would be a building type. We'll tell you if you want to build a multi-unit residential building, for example, if you stay under a certain number of floors, you don't have to include an elevator, which saves you a great deal of money and makes the project more feasible. And Andrés mentioned the Lean scan. That's the first one being developed. Hank will be giving an extensive presentation on that tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. When we go to identify the pilot project, scale is going to be very important. We don't want people to think of this as an entire city being our pilot project. It's going to be more like a neighborhood scale, maybe corridors if the town is small enough. Conceivably, it could even be an individual property. We will be conducting at least some of the pilot projects in night communities. There are, I've forgotten the number now, somewhere around 20 that we have to choose from.
Knight is the Knight Ridder newspapers.
Yes, John S. and James L. Knight had 20-something papers around the country, and they formed a foundation and located workers and offices in all of the communities where they had papers. And that's going to be one of the pools of candidates for our pilot projects. We've asked Hank Dittmar to take the primary lead on these pilot projects, and he is in the process of working with us. He's taken the lead on also working with us to find funding for these. As you saw in that early slide, $200,000 for the second year isn't going to take us very far in terms of these pilot projects that we want to implement. And so we'll be looking for additional funding for that. And I'm hoping Hank will discuss that in his presentation.
May I just say another thing? Hank has 2 roles. The other one is liaison with extraordinarily advanced activities in England, where things are actually moving very quickly top down. You know, the government is saying we have a deficiency of housing, and they already have quite amazing legislation that's already rolling, the kinds of things we can only dream about. And so I hope that we understand that he has two roles, the Hank the Englishman and Hank the American.
Dual citizenship.
Dual citizen.
There's a paper on the website about the English experiment in localism and reform.
That's right. Hank has written a case study about localism in England. Projection, as I said, will be an activity every year, and it's about raising awareness. Andrés will be doing a good bit of speaking, already has made several speeches just this year about lean urbanism, and Hank will be doing that as well. We'll be getting articles written, and of course the books and the videos that have already been discussed. The website we have I was going to call it a placeholder website, but it's beyond that now. It's a functioning website, still in progress, still in construction, but we now have roughly 20 of the papers that have been written, and as the time comes, we'll have the tools and all of this other information available. Social media is obvious. A brief discussion of our expenses. This is just a rough accounting of what has been allocated so far this year. You see that we're only halfway through the year, and we've already allocated more than 2/3 of our funding for this year.
Not spent, allocated.
Right. It's a combination of spent and allocated. And you see the biggest categories of spending. Moving into year 2, when we go to the pilot projects, the very rough, very general brief description of what form they will take is we'll go into the communities, use Hank's Lean Scan to assess them. We're going to find people to work with, figure out what projects we need to do, give them a try, evaluate them, implement the tools, and refine them, and then continue with the projection in year 2. Year 3, the idea right now is to have a major conference, perhaps national, conceivably a series of smaller conferences around the country to debut the toolkit and tell people about the revamped website that will have all the tools available on it, and, of course, projection.
Detroit, in some ways, was the beginning of this. And I'd like to actually describe that a little bit. By the way, Liz this morning added one thing to the second year, actually for the first year, which is the associated organizations that we've all been discovering, astoundingly sophisticated little bits of the same ethos, this people after the same thing. And so we had a discussion this morning about when to bring them in. We suspect that if we bring them in now, we're not going to make a very good, we're not going to put a very good face forward, because we're not in disarray, but we're in a creative phase. It's almost like an induced childhood. Yes, we could have figured everything out, 3 or 4 months ago, but this kind of stirring of the pot, I think, is very important. And so what I spoke to Liz, I said, so if you identify organizations that are sympathetic, ahead of us, that can actually give us credentials, because we're always asked, where has that been done before? There's that perennial question. We'd like to say, well, they're already doing it in Providence, and by the way, there's a specific thing I'm thinking about, or they're already doing this over there, they're already doing that over there, or there's a group that's already doing that. By the way, one of them might be the Main Street program, or the code that was written for renovations in New Jersey. The renovation subcode. And I'm seeing Ann over there. New Orleans is just a fount of creativity in this, because they can't get anything done. So they figured out very quickly how to do it. And so the second, we need to add that, which is identifying associated organizations. And I suspect we need to actually have a meeting of organizations, somewhere there. And just, now the other thing about this, like the CNU itself, I'd just like to actually make an important point. Did you see the list of books that we put in a poster written by New Urbanist authors? Which is, there's a booth upstairs that has a very large poster that has almost 160 books and other publications. They're either by CNU people, they're on New Urbanism, about New Urbanism, primarily about New Urbanism. Not one there is actually the many critical books in New Urbanism, which of course would have practically doubled the number. You know, we left those out. We thought that was unfair to make them seem like some of ours, although even the worst critiques actually have some good things to say. And then and then any that were actually, any author that doesn't want to, although they are New Urbanist, they prefer not to be New Urbanist, you know, sort of militant about it. The books that start, "We are not New Urbanists," and then they basically write the charter, they're not in there. Okay, we did not take on unwilling an unwilling crew. And yet there are 170 books. Not one of them was vetted. Not one of them was approved. Not one of them did we check about the use or protection of the term New Urbanism. You know, and that's one of the amazing things about this organization, which I think requires some real study. How is it possible that so much of such quality and of such mutual support was actually written without the kind of control that every other organization has? Like, for example, take LEAD. Anything that looks like the seal, anything that has, you know, 4 words with 2 E's in it, anything, you know, they just nail you. You know, they nail you. And most other organizations actually are like that, and we're not. And because of the success of this, we'd like you to feel that this initiative is yours. And nobody's going to stop you from using the terms, and nobody's going to stop you from, you know, I mean, this is going to spread, but do try to not just make it up as you're going along. Do try to sort of learn what it's about. And now that there is a website, you can actually check to actually see whether, for example, it's within the lean seam or not, which is something I'm going to talk about. Bruce, yes.
But this is why lean placemaking is trademarked art form under us.
Yeah. Lean placemaking has been registered, TM.
Not by us.
Not by us, right. No. So I don't know whether I feel that sometimes you have to register Lean Urbanism, not to protect it, but to protect somebody else from taking it. But who knows?
There's defensive, you can do it defensively.
Yeah, well, we need to talk about that, because there's a lot of TMing going along. By the way, Rem Koolhaas has registered most interesting words, just generally. Like high rise and pay me. So, yes?
I'm happy to be here at the Lean Urbanism session rather than at Rem Koolhaas's Venice Biennale.
But this week as well,
This week.
the Venice Biennale. Yeah, which by the way is a little bit about the collapse of the larger systems.
It is.
It's very interesting. You right?
But he'll say, hey, what the hey, let's party.
Yeah.
We're going to try to
Yeah,
do something about it.
yeah.
So,
It's an interesting prospect. The star architects are now actually saying, well, that's over. Let's do something else now. And it's okay. Now, I'm going to now speak a little bit about lean. I was going to speak very short on this because but there's actually more people that have not attended a session before than have. So I'm going to go a little bit longer than I thought originally, just particularly about the lean seam. Let's see. There was a great deal of confusion until in the internet discussion, until we made a diagram. And it was a diagram that was quickly done that positioned what our scale, in the continuity of a lot of scales. Like, that's one of the things I want to show. Subsidiarity, et cetera. Brian, the lean seam over there. Okay. There is a very quickly and successfully emerging urbanism, which is called tactical urbanism. It's a classic in how to get things done. It's something that was emerging all over the nation. People like Mike Lydon pulled it together. He immediately made an electronic book which took the position, and now he's writing what would be called a proper book. You know, a book that sort of credentialized, this is a book on paper by Island Press and so forth. Tactical urbanism is beautifully defined by Mike. I've read the introduction that he wrote. It's beautifully defined, and it has capabilities up to a certain point. And it isn't just what they call unsanctioned work, or temporary work or demonstration projects. It is moving into a position of actually permanent projects. I think that's fine, except that I think that insofar as it enters the realm of permanent projects, at some point it ceases being tactical. It becomes something else. Okay? The new urbanism, as I said, which had a wide array of scales and attitudes, has grown so mature and sophisticated that it can't really move quickly anymore. It's actually dealing with the biggest possible issues. I mean, people like Peter Calthorpe are writing essentially the code for China. I mean, I'm not kidding. He's made a couple of presentations. Peter is writing the criteria for regional planning based on carbon, which is going to be actually, if not already, rolled out in California. And as we know, if it rolls out in California, it rolls out in all the blue states, very quickly. And something else has to happen in the red states, but it takes over half the states. That's really big, sophisticated stuff. Laura Heery last night was showing how Sean Donovan, just before he stopped being the president of the head of HUD last 2 weeks ago, his last act was to make possible the inexpensive FHA and Fannie Mae, et cetera, mortgages for mixed-use units, for mixed-use housing. You can do up to 30% mixed use. Now, these are enormous things at the highest scale. It's taken Laura funding, it's taken Laura 3 or 4 years. And my personal feeling is that the weight of the new urbanism prevents it from doing a kind of work which is what tactical and lean do. It's inevitable. You can't both, when I made a military analogy, you can't have a heavy tank division and also cavalry. Cavalry can go in, it doesn't need any supplies, it feeds off the ground. A tank isn't like that. You need to fly in fuel, etc. And I'm glad we have a heavy division, like the new urbanism, but there's something left over. And this which is left over is, I personally think, is almost exactly what the next gen is hearkening after. There's a incredible movement called Next Gen within New Urbanism, which right now is looking for some focus. I think correctly, the first thing they figured out is how to have fun together, because there's an old rule that says no one will come to the second meeting of the revolution unless the first meeting was fun. And they got that really correctly. And if you follow the parallel CNU, which is happening by the next gen, you'll see that it's basically partying as soon as they get up in the morning and all the way through. And of course, they're on topic at the same time, but who wouldn't want to do this? So by the way, you remember the original Next Gen making really dull lectures? They would stand there giving dull lectures and nobody wanted to go. Well, they figured out that didn't work. So now Next Gen is rolling, and Lean Urbanism is of some appeal to them, because it's the kind of thing that people of that age and scale can work. Okay, so here we have the very latest version of a diagram, which for us clarified a lot of things. And there are a lot of variables here. In terms of urbanization, here we have tactical urbanism, lean urbanism, new urbanism, and then the APA, ITE, ULI, HYPER. These are organizations that have actually big headquarters buildings in Washington. Relative to them, we are the guerrillas. Okay, but relative to tactical, the CNU is heavy. So basically, lean urbanism overlaps with tactical and overlaps with new, but not completely. In fact, if we could, we wouldn't have any overlap. You're doing it, we don't need to pile on. But it's almost impossible to do that. But principally, not because we're not disciplined, but because tactical urbanism is actually moving into additional territory. So we're not protecting that frontier. You know, if tactical wants to move into what Lean is interested in, great. But however, we should not pile on to tactical, because that's absolutely well in hand. They're doing a great job. So this is where we are. The second here are the kinds of projects. And there are flash projects, there are successional projects, there are permanent projects, and there are climax projects. Okay, a flash project is a demonstration project. Chair bombing, let's put the stripes on the road in watercolor paint, and water-based paint, so the rain washes it off. You know, let's take a parking lot and put sod on it for a weekend to demonstrate it could be a park. And that can be either sanctioned or unsanctioned, but essentially it's not permanent. It's very fast, very effective, and it's about polemicizing it. You know, there are lots of analogies as to why that works. Then there are successional projects, which are very interesting, which are projects that start small. They're permitted and they're permanent, but they start small and they get bigger. And for example, Seaside started small and got bigger. Seaside started with, you know, impermanent retail, and it incubated its retailers, and then they downloaded them to why don't you, I think I don't have to, oh, I can't read it is the problem. What happened to that? Battery. Okay, so battery. The successional project is very important. Virtually all first-generation new urbanism and all 19th century urbanism in America was successional. You know, you begin with a shanty town, you build the sod town, you build the brick town, you build the granite town, then you build a high-rise town, and Manhattan has a successional piece. Urbanism is successional. What happened in the tail end of the 20th century is that the new urbanists began proposing climax projects. Our town centers, and I mean also DPZ ones, were projected at 4 to 8 stories from the beginning. It wasn't how we started. We started, you know, let's incubate it, let's get going, and then suddenly every project was 4 stories from the beginning, and for every 100 feet of 4-story town center, that's $15 million. And so, of course, the town centers weren't happening. Now, that wasn't our fault. The bankers wanted to give the big loans. Everything was in a hurry. The system was incapable of recognizing a successional project. Excellent, thank you so much. A successional project, okay. Obviously, successional projects eventually become permanent, but what they're not, what you will see there, is that they're not climax projects. Any climax project, you know, the complete TOD building and so forth, somebody else is doing that, and it's not Lean. So succession is very important. The next thing is the kind of business, because we are as interested in the hardware as in the software. So you can't just build a city without the businesses happening and the businesses of development and so forth. So there's informal business, which by the way is what the immigrants do. Informal business is you just duck, you know, until somebody finds you. It's building things without permits, it's just starting stuff. Any immigrant city like Miami has a huge gray economy. And the reason is that they can't figure out the system. These are not dishonest people, they just can't figure out the system. They don't know how to read the codes, they don't know the lawyers. And then there are unregistered businesses, which are businesses that are, let us say, intending to become fully legitimate, but can't quite handle it at the beginning. That makes us really get efficient. Like, you know, what we've done, like, you know, Brian works all the time in this. And it's amazing how short a time a year is. You know, we're just galloping and galloping and galloping, and we're barely going to get anything done for the first year. So actually, there's something to be said for actually getting grants that discipline you. But that is not the ideal. Now, over here, in terms of regulation, bear this in mind, there's a great deal of confusion. Okay, we're going to meet the codes. This is not, originally there was a lot of hand-wringing. What happens when you actually don't follow the health and safety codes and so forth? We're going to meet the codes because reforming the codes is too difficult. It is heavy work. The CNU is doing that. What we're going to do is figure out the bypasses. How is it that you actually get around that wide street? Well, there's 6 engineers that know how to do that. How do you think the new urbanist communities get built? We'd like to make that available to everybody, not just the big developers. How does John Anderson build smaller buildings that are so economical? Because he understands the exact threshold. Under this, if I stay under this size, and under this, and under the, I don't need a sprinkler, I don't need a second fire stair, I don't need, I don't need to meet handicap codes, etc. And those of us who are operating in this world know this. Now, how long it took John Anderson to figure that out, you don't want to know. But as soon as he knows that, why can't, for example, there be dozens, hundreds of developers building the small apartment buildings that the cities, is precisely what the cities need, and precisely, it's a wonderful way to make a living. You can actually make a permanent living owning little apartments in small increments. Now, if you meet all the codes, the handicap codes, you're immediately in a large project because you need corridors, you need elevators, and you need $30 million just to get up in the morning. So that disqualifies you. So thresholds as a tool, what I call a cutting tool, there's a term that we're initiating called a cutting tool that actually says above that you're welcome, but below that it's lean. And we'd like to have all those cutting tools. So as well as so we will meet health and safety codes. We will, however, tamper tremendously with land use codes. Land use codes are not about health and safety. They're about a whole bunch of vested interests and sort of dead old ideas, and we're definitely going to get around those. And then there are the environmental codes, which actually are unfortunately in the form of LEED emerging as very, very heavy, expensive codes that require consultants. And you know, we have Steve Mouzon, who has been working on the original green. You know, the idea that you can actually have a pot-bellied stove. And a pot-bellied stove actually allows you to inhabit a house in Providence or Detroit or Buffalo without actually completely redoing the heating system, right? You know, because the thing doesn't work. The thing was installed in 1910 and it works on oil and it's rusted to death, and getting a new one is, yay, $10,000 everywhere. You hear about this all the time. And yet a pot-bellied stove will heat it at $1,000. But is that LEED qualified? No, they don't recognize it. They don't recognize the virtues of a curtain, of a thick curtain, you know, and what it does instead of having an $800 window that's double glazed. And so there are all these old ways of doing things that actually we want not only to alert you to them, because honestly, it's the way our parents lived, but we don't even know how it is, but actually qualify it and say, well, here's lean certification. Because LEED is very, very high tech. It's become biased to very high tech. I mean, if you've ever touched it, you realize that it is almost the poster child for heavy going. And we're not against it. By the way, I've asked them, I said, would you like to take this on? I've asked some pretty top people in LEED. It says, no, go ahead. I mean, they're not gonna fight us. But they said, we can't do it because we need to test every curtain because we're scientists. So if you bring up the curtain, we'll test it. But, you know, there's probably, 8,000 curtains that we're not gonna bring up. And so it goes. So environmental is very much our agenda. Yes, Bruce, please.
One of the things to understand that we've been talking about is that the stuff on the right-hand side, where you have AIA and the ULI and so on, what's happening is that they've gone to Washington to capture the regulatory apparatus in order to essentially create a vassal, make everybody into vassals. If you aren't part of the big, if you're not part of the big companies, you can only do the very small stuff. They can't kind of push back at human rights too hard, but basically, another way to look at it is that the lean seam is sort of the battleground between the small and big, and a lot of the reasons that we need to do bypasses is because the regulatory system has been captured by big business, and big regulating is actually part of a collusion to keep ordinary people from doing things unless they do it as part of a big business.
By the way, Bruce has written the paper on the ethics of lean.
And
You know,
if that sounds communist,
He sometimes sounds communistic.
Ethics are communist now?
ethics are communist, and today, ethics have become communist.
So Bruce was Bruce is one of 2 or 3 people in the discussion group that was actually thinking that the whole thing was unethical. That, this is somehow, it'll be captured by people who will immediately abuse it and become horrible landlords, or people would, that would be injured by improperly handled codes. And he shifted the whole lean. Bruce and others have shifted the lean seam to actually the meeting of codes. So we're not going to sort of ignore the codes, but meeting the codes while somebody else reforms the codes, because they are excessive and gold-plated. But he's also written the paper on the ethics of it.
If you know how to do it right, if you're an immigrant from a country where people can build and do stuff on their own, and you come to America and you know how to do it right, you have a moral standing to be able to do it. And it's actually unjust to stop you from doing it, and that's a big lever for us.
Okay. And one of the things that you might not know is that the ability to do things for yourself was everywhere possible until very recently. The ability to build things for yourself, the ability to renovate for yourself, the ability to initiate, has gradually disappeared since 1970, and particularly since the International Building Code came in, less than 10 years ago. So we're speaking to people like myself who saw that world. This isn't going back to some ancient civilization that's unrecognizable. And one of the reasons that actually this tends to be a movement of the older folk is that we're complicit in the explosion of the regulatory environment. It was precisely our generation that actually created the regulatory environment that make things impossible for the young. But when we were young, we could get things done. So in some ways, this is, it really takes the old players to understand how the system works and get rid of it. So that's one of the odd things about lean urbanism, is that it's a double generational thing, endeavor, with the older generation actually doing certain things and the younger generation doing another thing. It's not the same. I think it's very rare that I would ask a young person to say, why don't you read the code this thick and tell us what's wrong with it? Because you don't know. You know exactly what's wrong with it, but you know it's preventing you. Hank, yes?
Yeah, it wasn't wrong to go after DDT.
Yeah.
Rachel Carson was right.
Yeah.
And so regulation is not
Per
the
se.
wrong thing. And what's important about what Bruce just said is that over the last 15 or 20 years, we have seen the major industry associations and big companies who achieve dominance in a market, capturing the regulatory process to ensure continued dominance for their products, and that has disadvantaged small people without the resources to compete within that environment.
See, that's the. It's very important to understand the ethics of it, where the seam is and where it isn't, right? And I can give you an example now, which I won't because it's very specific. What has happened with the electrical code in the last 5 years, and what that has done to the possibility of renovation? It's basically made renovation impossible. You need to have electricians from top to bottom, and that's a very strong example of that. And yet we all live in the old code. By the way, there are places like Providence, Rhode Island, in which the architects can now sign and actually say, I am responsible for meeting the regulations. I don't need to show it to a bureaucrat, and that kind of thing, is extremely important because it enables people who anyway have responsibility in any case. So the ethics are very important. Now, in terms of infrastructure there's demonstration infrastructure, but most important, there is what we used to do in this country, and actually is, for example, the platform in which Seaside was built with very little cost, which is light imprint infrastructure, which happens to be highly ecological. To do things lightly on the ground, and that is being led by Paul Crabtree. And interestingly, he's studying the old 19th century engineering, where, one way to think about it is the entire continent was colonized by people without money. For example, the Mormons alone built over 700 towns and cities with virtually no money in the 19th century, and they succeeded. So you have to look at that and say, how was that done? Why must development always be so damned expensive when actually the whole of American history is full of examples? So one of the really interesting aspects about infrastructure is that it's something that has rarely happened, which is you have engineers studying their own history. It's fascinating to actually see engineers looking backwards instead of just to innovation. Now, if you look at engineering innovation, you just have to buy more stuff. Oh, you want a drainage? You want to have a proper hydrological drainage? Well, there's this new drain now that costs $10,000. And there's a company that provides it, as opposed to saying, whatever happened to the swale?